So I never formally researched adult attachment, but I do use it in my clinical work as a couples therapist. I've been trained in emotionally focused therapy for couples and families that uses attachment theory as its base. And I definitely see the world through an attachment lens. It's how I make sense of the interactions between myself and my husband, my children, my parents, my friends, and even my colleagues in the workplace. So in this PowerPoint, first I'll talk about how attachment is similar for all of us across our lifespans and how it relates to our neurobiology. And then we'll transition into talking about how attachment styles can be different based on individuals. We'll talk about what this means for attachment and sexuality. Then we'll translate it into common patterns of distress in couples. And then we'll finish by talking about strategies to create attachment security. We tend to think of attachment as something between a parent and child, but what we know is that attachment is hardwired into us across our lifespans. It has profound psychobiological implications, which we're going to talk about, and it's a pretty powerful motivating force. My own most powerful moment in accepting my own attachment needs came when I was a doctoral student and I had just had a baby. I was also learning about attachment theory and delivering an attachment-based therapeutic intervention with one of my professors. And one night I was driving back from the intervention with her, and it was late at night, and I was confessing to her in the darkness of the car that I was worried that I just needed my mom too much. I was really feeling a strong need for my mom after I'd had my first child. But it kind of mystified me because I was happily married and I was 30 years old. Anyway, my professor's name was Margaret, and Margaret said very simply in that dark car, as I confessed my fears, "Ashley, we all need other people." And I really felt a weight come off my shoulders to know there was nothing wrong with me. And in fact, now what I know about attachment theory is that during times of huge transition, like the transition to parenthood, it makes sense that my attachment needs would have gone up, and I might have been looking towards my mom for more connection and support. John Bowlby said these attachment behaviors were universal throughout our lives, and so I'll talk about how we can see them in adult romantic relationships. So proximity maintenance is basically keeping tabs on our romantic partners. When are you coming home? When you're not there when I think you're going to be, what's holding you up? If you're traveling, I might want to make sure you got there safely. So basically, we want to know where our loved ones are and what they're doing. Safe haven is the idea that if something scary happens, we all have people we want to get comfort from. So if you came out from work or school and found that your car or bike had been stolen, you'd probably call somebody on the phone for comfort. And these are often your attachment figures. Separation distress is, as it sounds, that we don't like to be separated. We don't like to have to say goodbye to our romantic partners for unusual periods of time. But we'll see when we get into couple conflict that often what is fueling it is not actual separation distress, but perceived separation distress. We're in the same house, we're living together, but I can't find you. I don't feel connected to you. I perceive that we are disconnected. Secure base is just the idea that with attachment, independence and dependence go together. Dependence isn't a bad thing, and we actually need to have people we can count on in order to go out into the world, do our good work, and be successful. This is sort of the wind beneath my wings idea, however corny that is. It's also maybe the image of being a trapeze artist and needing a safety net in order to be able to jump off. And so you might note that sometimes when you're feeling disconnected from somebody important in your life, it's actually hard to go and do your good work. Bowlby also said that regarding separation distress, we have a predictable pattern across our life times. And so for adults, protest could be angry or upset or defensive. It could be arising, for example, during conflict. Despair is, the sadness when you can't kind of reconnect either physically or emotionally. And then detachment, because you can't stay in despair all the time, is, turning to things that bring you comfort, whether that's friends or social media or your work. I personally notice this pattern, and my husband and I joke about it every time he goes on a trip, even if it's for work. Initially, I have some protest behaviors. Don't go, don't leave me, that kind of stuff. And then when he does leave, I notice that the kids and I are often more kind of sad or irritable the first day that he's gone, especially when they were littler. And then we kind of move on. We detach, we get into our groove, we talk on the phone, we miss each other. But then what's really interesting is that I'm always thinking that I'm really looking forward to my husband coming home. And then when he does come home, I'm mad at him. He walks in the door and I'm simultaneously so glad to see him, but because I now kind of have this inherent, perhaps I can't trust you, I now am like, you have to do all the chores before, I'm going to trust you again, or something like that. And that relates to what Bowlby found too in his research on kids, is that kids who had to be separated from their parents would eventually move into detachment and look like they were okay. But when they got reunited with their parents, they were angry and protesting again. There was a disruption in the attachment. So this graph shows us how our fear systems and our attachment systems are interrelated. So let's imagine that we experience something threatening, like we had a negative meeting with our boss. And so that might activate our fear system, starting with our amygdala that says, danger, danger, you're in trouble. And that primes our HPA axis, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that gets our body ready for kind of a fight-flight response, activates our sympathetic nervous system. And if this is going on, if our fear system has been activated along with our sympathetic and HPA systems, and we have access to a supportive partner or person, which is 3A in the diagram, then that's access to that supportive person actually stimulates our attachment system in the hypothalamus, which releases oxytocin, which is that lovely kind of cuddle chemical that comes both with orgasm and skin-to-skin contact and breastfeeding, but also just with close sharing with friends. And oxytocin helps us calm our fear system down. So our attachment system can actually calm our fear system. And interestingly, for 3B there, if we aren't in the presence of a supportive partner or person, our sympathetic and HPA systems will actually just tell our attachment system to release oxytocin, which basically helps us bond with whoever is around us, which is why I think people bond together during stressful times, even people who don't know each other that well. And then that will help us calm our fear systems down. Interestingly, if you go back up to the top and our partner is also a source of threat, then that probably explains most of the difficulties in romantic relationships, as our partners are both causing our fear system to activate, and yet our attachment system is telling us that we should access them to help us calm down. And so that's probably why our relationships are so challenging, because we can perceive our partners to be threatening because they're rolling their eyes or tightening their mouth, or they have an edge in their voice, but we also need them to help us feel comforted and connected. There's been some research that shows how the effects of having an attachment relationship can actually influence our body's response to stress or threats or pain or fear. So this was a series of studies that involved placing married women in MRI machines. And if you've ever been in an MRI machine, you know they're those narrow tubes that a lot of us hate. And they told them they might additionally get some potential shocks on their toes in order to induce even more fear. And so then they put them in a series of conditions where they were randomly assigned to be either holding no one's hand while they were in the machine, or holding the hand of a stranger, or holding the hand of their partner. And what they found was that holding their partner's hand reduced the perceptions of threat in their brain, that the fear centers of their brain were not lit up so much. And that finding was greater than holding a stranger's hand or holding no one's hand. And it was even greater the higher relationship satisfaction that they had. And it also improved if they went through some sessions of emotionally focused therapy. This is a little bit of a newer model for thinking about the formation of attachments by Bex and Cohn, called the distress relief dynamic. And I think it's useful for understanding how both secure attachments forms and insecure attachment forms. So we can imagine, even if starting with a young baby, if a baby is in distress, hopefully they get some support from a responsive and sensitive caregiver, and then they experience some relief. And that cycle repeats itself. And if it is consistent enough, it doesn't have to be perfect, but consistent, then they're going to form a secure attachment with that caregiver. And so we might imagine that for adults, we could have a similar pattern. With our partners or family or friends, when we're in distress, we turn to them for support. And if they're supportive and we feel some relief, then we're more likely to repeat that cycle. And we're probably less likely to continue in relationships with people where we don't get a little bit of support and relief. But when things go awry, so for example, in childhood, we have an infant or a toddler in distress who's learned that they don't always get the support that they want and from their attachment figure, and thus not the relief, then they kind of have to learn other strategies to kind of be quiet and maybe maintain some space, proximal space to the caregiver, but just focus on playing with their toys. Or maybe they learn that they have to kind of amp up and be really vocal about their distress in order to get the response that they need. And then lastly, we could imagine that sometimes this has gone well in an adult romantic relationship, and then it starts to break down, right? You used to be supportive for me and I used to get relief, but that's not happening anymore. I like this Winnie the Pooh graphic. It's from a Hallmark card because I think it illustrates attachment well. And I want to make the point that once you start putting on an attachment hat, you can see attachment all around you in cards, in songs, in religion, in research studies that don't know that they're about attachment, but probably are. So Bowlby hypothesized that how attachment tends to perpetuate itself over our lifetimes is through our internal working models of selves and others. And so starting with our earliest caregiving experiences as babies, we begin to create internal working models of ourselves and others, these mental representations. And when we have mostly sensitive and responsive caregivers, then we're more likely to feel that we're worthy or lovable and that others are trustworthy and caring. And when we don't have those, when we get the short end of the stick, then we struggle more. And to be honest, I haven't met anyone who doesn't struggle to some extent. I've not met anyone who has perfect internal working models for themselves and others. These tend to be very basic fears for us as humans. But what we know is that these internal working models can start to become self-fulfilling prophecies. So if I'm worried that I may not be lovable, then I might come off as more anxious or a little bit more clingy, and I might actually push people away unintentionally, which then just confirms that I'm not worthy or lovable. And if I'm worried that others aren't trustworthy or caring, then I might kind of hide things from them and not share them with them. And then they get, for example, upset or disappointed or mad at me when they find out I haven't been very self-disclosing, and that just for me confirms that I can't trust them or count on them. I always find it very interesting as a therapist when people are talking about something they're upset about to hear kind of which internal working model is more salient or bigger for them. So as they're talking about their stress, are they talking about it in a way that says there must be something wrong with me, or are they talking about it in a way that says there must be something wrong with them? And so you might reflect for a minute on which internal working model tends to be more of a challenge for you. So, does attachment remain the same across our lifetimes? Is it continuity? Is it stability? Or does attachment change? Is it more discontinuous across our lifetimes? And this also relates to whether or not attachment is kind of a trait, like my attachment style is blank, and that we carry that with us, or is attachment more of a state describing our current level of security with any given one person? And the attachment literature reflects all of this, kind of both of these, and you'll notice that even in the PowerPoint I kind of am talking about them both at the same time, both continuous and discontinuous as a trait and as a state. Related to discontinuity or change is the idea of earned security in terms of attachment styles. So this is, a smaller area of research in the attachment world, but basically says that people could start off getting the short end of the stick in terms of attachment and their early caregivers, but eventually find their way to earned security and being able to create more secure relationships with others. And in one small study of kind of new mothers that were interviewed using the adult attachment interview, they found about, a little over 10% of these were classified as earned secure, with about 50% kind of being continuously secure, from childhood to adulthood, and like 40% being one of the forms of insecurity. So this is a more recent study that interviewed 20 individuals who met the criteria for a history of attachment insecurity and then evidence for earning security in their adult relationships. And across all 20 people, these were the themes for kind of their processes in earning security. And the darker kind of shaded boxes were stronger kind of themes than the dashed line boxes. So I'll talk you through these. So the first set is around that meta conditions of earning security. So that's kind of, what else was kind of happening to support them. And so many of them reported that they were being intentional, they were engaging in self-reflection, or being reflective about their words and actions with others, or that they were overcoming kind of setbacks or barriers to growth. And this was often described as grueling or a battle or something they had to persist in. They reported having had surrogate attachment figures, whether this was kind of early people early on in their lives, like aunts and uncles, who were safe for them, or it could have been God or faith, or many people said their partners in adulthood were key, also mentors and friends. Using therapy, nearly all the 20 people reported attending therapy at some point. And then kind of moving more into making changes, intrapsychic changes there are kind of redefining their identity, this kind of idea of this isn't how I want to be in relationships. I want to be different. I want to be more secure, and gaining more compassion for themselves, seeing themselves in a more positive light, that they weren't broken, that they were good enough. And then also giving up a victim mentality instead of continuing to blame those that hurt them in the past, which makes sense. They began to kind of more intentionally own responsibility for their actions. And then making interpersonal changes. So trying to make peace with the past. This was like family of origin work, such as stopping striving for parents' approval, setting boundaries, forgiving, and understanding their caregivers from a new perspective, or taking small risks, such as being vulnerable with partners and therapists, kind of taking risks in those ways. So far, we've been talking about how people are similar in terms of attachment behaviors, but as you may remember, Mary Ainsworth with the Strange Situation experiment, and then followed up by Mary Main, talked about how people could be different in terms of attachment styles, and they were focused on kids, but this eventually got translated into adults as well. And in adulthood, we think about two different continua related to attachment. The extent to which someone has attachment-related anxiety or tends to amp up when they are upset, or the extent to which a person has attachment-related avoidance or tends to kind of deactivate or get quiet when they are upset. And obviously we all have some of both of these, but people who are categorized as more securely attached are lower on both attachment-related anxiety and avoidance. There are quite a few adult attachment-related measures, and here's some sample items from one that is used frequently and that I've used, called the ECRS. These are the anxiety items that somebody might rate on a Likert scale, and so the more you say agree or strongly agree to these items, the greater the indicator of attachment-related anxiety. Similarly, these are the items for avoidance, and R just means reverse scored. So if someone answered strongly agree to that, that would actually get scored as a low indicator of avoidance. So you can take these two continua and overlap them to create 4 categories that correspond to the 4 categories of attachment styles in childhood, but to make things more confusing with some different names. So secure has stayed the same and means lower on avoidance and anxiety. Preoccupied, which would be the childhood term, or it would be the adult term for the childhood. Anxious ambivalent is preoccupied. It can also just be referred to as anxious, and that's how I'll refer to it in this PowerPoint. If you are high on avoidance and low on anxiety, then you would be categorized as dismissing avoidant, which was called anxious avoidant, I believe, in childhood. And here in this PowerPoint, we'll just call avoidant. And that if you happen to be high on both, then it would be categorizing of fearful avoidant, which in childhood was called disorganized. And if the website on this slide still works, you can go to it and answer a series of attachment questions, something like 10 questions for a mother figure, father figure, friend, and romantic partner. And it'll plot all 4 data points for you on this chart. And then you can see if your attachment is more stable, if it's more like a trait across your relationships, or if your attachment is more changing like a trait and varies across your relationships. So sometimes people get categorized as more secure and being lower, which is lower on avoidance and anxiety, and they are generally more able to express both positive and negative emotions with their partners. They're also able to give their partners more the benefit of the doubt. So if my husband comes home late and I'm feeling less secure, then I'm going to wonder, is he not that into me? Does he not care about me? Does he not respect me? But if I'm securely attached to him, then I'm able to just think, oh, he was running late. People who are more securely attached are also able to give their partners more comfort and support when they are kind of in a needy place, which is hard to do, right? None of us love it when our people are having hard times, but people who are secure can kind of hang in there a little bit better. People who are higher on attachment-related avoidance often don't seek some support from their partner when they're upset, or might delay a few days before they do that. They kind of internalize it for a while. They can find it also more difficult to provide support when their partner is anxious or needy, and they might have a tendency to withdraw at that time. They often kind of get into their head because they're afraid of getting it wrong, and they overwhelm themselves, and so they kind of pull away because they don't know how to help. They also tend to minimize or dismiss hurts to themselves, so you don't always know how upset they are. And they tend to restrict their emotional expression and focus more on intellectualizing or tasks. When people are higher on attachment-related anxiety, perhaps someone like myself, we tend to maximize or exaggerate our hurts. So when we're upset, you generally know we're upset because we're telling you about it. We might expect more support or more validation. We can also be more hypervigilant. So if you're coming home late or you seem distracted or you're excited about something else, does that mean you're not that into me? We can also come across as more demanding and more emotional. So when we've gotten the short end of the stick in life and people that we should have been able to trust early on, we couldn't because maybe they were dangerous or abusive or traumatizing, then we can end up high on both avoidance and anxiety. And obviously we all have some avoidance and anxiety, but for people who are higher on both, this is usually about less than 10% of the population. And what it means is that there's this strong desire for connection, but then a really big fear that it's not safe. So maybe more of a push and pull than we would normally experience.
Okay, so the bullet points on this slide are all about kind of dating styles and how someone who is more on the anxious side of attachment might sometimes come across. And so, many of us can relate to these, and these are important things to kind of maybe check ourselves on in our dating relationships. So those of us who are more anxious, we can think a lot about the relationship, right? And we can come across as a little bit too overeager in the relationship. And we have a tendency to disclose too much negative information about ourselves too soon. and perhaps overwhelm our prospective dating partners. We tend to overestimate in the similarity between us and maybe idealize our partner and be like, oh, we're just the same, more so than we actually are. We tend to be a little bit more kind of interpreting things that happen in the relationship or that the partner is doing that is about us. And we can play games in our own ways. For example, trying to give a partner the silent treatment or not contact them or, play it cool, even though we don't really feel like it. All right, so those of us who are more avoidant might kind of relate to some of these things in dating relationships. So generally not disclosing as much about ourselves, kind of keeping things in more, even if our partners are disclosing more, focusing more on our independence and not wanting to commit, maybe sending some mixed signals about kind of wanting to be with you but not really. And then using some distancing strategies when things get too close. So making some kind of, doing some mean teasing maybe to distance or, other strategies. Avoiding, for example, talking on the phone. If there's a fight, trying to really get out of it quickly. And kind of keeping our partners kind of guessing as to where we think this relationship might be going. Kind of out of our struggle to commit and our fear of being close. All right, so just to highlight some things that we might be trying to aim for if we're not there already. So people who are more secure in dating relationships are a little bit more stable, reliable, consistent, flexible, can compromise, can have relationship-oriented, focused discussions as to kind of what the future of the relationship is, can generally handle conflict, talking about what's bothering them or listening to what the other person has to say, is focused more on getting things worked out than being right. May it sometimes get nervous about closeness, but it doesn't lead to kind of big reactive distancing behaviors. Generally kind of introduces their partners to family and friends, less game playing. And I think these last two are particularly interesting. People who are more secure change how much they're disclosing based on how much the partner is sharing. So if their partner is sharing more personal information, then they will share more personal. And if their partner is sharing less, then they will share less. And people who have more attachment security historically, currently, do a better job of striking that balance between closeness and separateness, which I think is super challenging in a dating relationship, hard for all of us, but some people maybe do a little bit better job finding that balance.
So this slide just generally refers to attachment security as compared with attachment security. So it includes both forms of high anxiety or high avoidance. So in general, the more attachment insecurity we have, the maybe more mixed feelings we have during sex, more anxiety about sex, struggling more with sexual desire and sexual arousal, maybe not feeling as high sexual self-esteem. We're less likely to openly discuss sexual safety or our sexual needs and desires. This can also be related to having less safe sex and more substance use in order to have sex. And it is also correlated with females being sexually coerced and males being sexually coercive. So attachment-related avoidance can be associated with more sex, but with less commitment or emotional involvement, or avoidance of close, intimate sex. And sex may not be associated with love in the minds of people who are have more of an avoidant attachment style. And they may use sex more for, helping themselves feel better in a variety of ways. Whereas those of us who maybe have higher attachment-related anxiety might have more mixed attitudes, more ambivalence towards casual sex as compared to people who have higher avoidance. We may be having sex not so much for ourselves, but to please the other, and we may be more likely to think about sex and love as the same thing. Research has indicated that attachment security is basically correlated with a lot of things that we want in our romantic relationships. So this tells us that paying attention to attachment and connection is worthwhile if we want to achieve these goals. Research indicates that couples with an insecure attachment to one another basically can't resolve conflict as well, as you can see from these lists. And I think this is because they're not actually arguing about what they think they're arguing about. They're not arguing about the content, which is where we're going to go out to eat or who's going to do this chore or where we're going to live. Instead, what they're arguing about is this deeper thing, which is, do you care about me? Do you see me? Do you value me? Do you need me? Do you want to be with me? And as long as that goes unaddressed and unresolved, everything about the content becomes much more challenging to resolve because it's not really what they're arguing about. So, separate from the adult attachment research literature, researchers also study the demand-withdrawal pattern of distress in couple relationships. And it's important to remember that all relationships have patterns such as demand-withdrawal or withdraw, even those that are happy and satisfied. The most common pattern is the demand-withdrawal pattern, or we also call it the pursue-withdraw pattern. And that pattern emerges for a variety of reasons, or at least that's what we theorize. So Gottman, for example, in the reading that you did, suggests that women are socialized to be more critical and contemptuous and men more stonewalling and defensive. And other researchers have found that that's also sometimes the case for heterosexual couples, but other times, maybe about a third of the time, females are more the withdrawers and males are more of the pursuers. And it's also important to know that demand-withdrawal patterns happen in same-sex couples too, so it's not just about gender. And if sometimes couples don't have so much of a demand-withdrawal pattern, but they have more of a withdraw-withdraw or a demand-demand pattern, and with attachment theory in mind, we can actually conceptualize these as based on your attachment style and your degree of attachment-related anxiety or avoidance. So people who have higher attachment-related anxiety are more likely to be in the demand or pursue position, and people who with more attachment-related avoidance are more likely to be in the withdraw position. And it's all relative to who you're with. So when I'm meeting with couples, I have them fill out the survey like I showed you for anxiety and avoidance, and then I compile their scores and I compare them and I talk to them about who's higher on anxiety, who's higher on avoidance, and make some predictions about who is more likely to be the pursuer and who is more likely to be the withdrawer. And of course, it can really vary in couples and be more complex. Okay, so this is where systems theory and attachment theory come together. So you remember your systems cycles, and we can start a cycle anywhere. It's just a pattern of interaction. And this is a cycle for Sally and Nancy, a romantic couple. Sally would like to spend more time with her partner, Nancy. She gets angry that Nancy is working so much. And when Nancy comes home, she criticizes her. You haven't been there. I'm doing everything with the kids. Nancy's frustrated that her working is not appreciated, her stress is not acknowledged. She tries to defend or explain herself, and when she does that, Sally intensifies. She starts making her case even more, louder, faster. Then Nancy gets overwhelmed. She can't find the words, and that's really the hallmark of the withdrawer, to feel like she's making it worse. And so she shuts down, she removes herself from the conversation. She wants to feel closer, but she doesn't know how. So she withdraws into work, a place where she'll feel more comfortable. And if we think of those attachment behaviors in response to separation distress, we can see protest, despair, and detachment in this cycle. This is perceived separation distress. They can't seem to find each other. And so we can see protest in Sally's criticism, in Nancy's defense, despair perhaps for both of them when the argument is over but unresolved, and then we can imagine that they would detach, retreat into what feels comfortable until something sparks again their lack of connection. And we could also imagine that from a systems perspective, Sally thinks this is Nancy's problem and Nancy thinks that this is Sally's problem. But in the end, it just reflects a disconnect in their relationship, that neither one is sure that the other person really cares about them, really values them, really sees them, and really needs them. This slide is just a follow-up to provide evidence that attachment styles do seem to be correlated with the demand-withdraw pattern, with avoidance being more associated with withdrawal. You can see those kind of examples up there: less attention, less facial gaze, less kind of smiling, and more minimization and distance in conflict. Anxious attachment in conflict is associated with more kind of amping up rumination, and experiencing couple conflict is kind of more harmful over the long term. So a lot of times we can feel like things are going well in our relationship, and then suddenly we can start to put more pressure on our relationships to meet our attachment needs. And our attachment needs can basically activate when our fear systems get activated. And that can be because there's something external to our relationship that makes us feel uncertain or vulnerable, like a bad evaluation at work, or the death of someone close to us. Or our fear systems can be activated within our romantic relationship if we, for example, perceive our partner to be dismissing of us, or we experience ourselves to be disconnected from them. So to illustrate how we can use our attachment perspective to illustrate everyday interactions in our romantic relationships, I tell this old story about my husband and I road biking. So a few years ago, my husband and I got road bikes so that we would have something to do together. But because at that time we had small children, we usually had to get a babysitter if we wanted to go out together. So most of the time we were riding separately, either alone or with friends. And what I noticed was that when we did get a babysitter and go out on a date, I actually often felt fairly irritable or grumpy. And I would wonder, what's wrong with me? Because I'm supposed to be happy. We're going on this biking date. But as we would get ready to go and start out, I felt cranky. And as I was riding along behind my husband, I decided to put on my attachment hat and think, why is this? Because when I'm on my own, I actually feel quite empowered. Even though I'm a little scared about those skinny tires and my feet clipped in, I'm also pretty impressed with myself that I can climb those hills. And I sing actually Michael Jackson in my head. I'm bad, I know it. But I didn't feel that way when I was riding behind my husband. And I realized that it's a few different things. My husband's a lot faster than me. And so when I start riding with him, I'm kind of worried that he's disappointed that I'm so slow. It's a lot about my internal working model of self, that somehow I'm not good enough, right? And so what I project is on him is that, gosh, he must be thinking, why did I agree to do this? This isn't going to be any fun. Like, oh, I wish I was biking with one of my friends. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm almost unconsciously thinking as I, of course, ride along behind him. And when he stopped to wait for me, as I was thinking about this one day, I realized I kind of had a decision. I could stay cranky and just complain about how my butt hurts and it's hot and I'm sweaty and the hills are hard, or I could take a risk and tell him about my fears. And so that's what I did. I told him, I'm worried that he doesn't really want to be with me and I'm too slow and he'd rather be riding with a friend so he could get a real workout. And he's able to reassure me and say, no, I really want to be with you. It's okay that you're slow. It's more important that we're together than for me to get a workout. And of course I say, are you sure? Really? Are you sure you don't want to go on ahead? And he says, no, I really do want to be with you. And as it turns out, we have to have this conversation almost every time we ride bikes together. We just get a little bit faster at that. And so it's a way of using attachment theory to make sense of just everyday tensions in our romantic relationships. So if we think about that pursue withdraw or demand withdraw pattern, and we think about it from an attachment lens, then we can really reframe why people are acting in some of these undesirable behaviors or these ways. So even if the pursuer sounds kind of critical and angry, they're actually fighting for connection. And even though withdrawers look shut down and like they don't care, they're often protecting themselves and maybe also the relationship from further damage. We're going to be talking about this more when we talk about emotionally focused therapy, but basically, a way to diffuse the demand withdrawal pattern is to begin to understand the feelings that underlie each position. And this takes people time to do this, either in therapy or on their own. And I think of the metaphor as kind of peeling back the layer of an onion. So pursuers maybe start in their outermost layer is that they're angry, right? And they're critical. And so then they maybe have to become aware under that they're actually more hurt and they feel kind of disconnected. And then maybe under that, they realize that they feel unimportant or invisible. And then maybe at their kind of deepest, most fearful layer, they feel alone or abandoned or just desperate for connection. Whereas people who are more in the withdrawer position, maybe because of more avoidant attachment styles, they initially will say something like, when you ask them, like, what are you feeling? They'll say things like, I don't know, or they'll shrug their shoulders and say nothing. And that's because they've coped by deactivating and minimizing their emotional experiences. And so it can take them longer to put words to their feelings and to realize, okay, maybe I'm frustrated, or I feel criticized, or I feel overwhelmed. And maybe if they drop further into that over weeks or months, they start to realize, okay, yeah, I feel inadequate, or like I'm a disappointment to him or to her. And then maybe at the deepest, most kind of fearful, primitive layer is that I feel ashamed or alone. And so when people can slowly begin to kind of unpack these layers and tap into them and talk to each other about them, then that diffuses that kind of angry, pursue, kind of defend, shut down cycle, and it kind of draws their partners to them more, right? Just kind of like in my biking story, sharing my vulnerabilities kind of allowed my husband to come toward me rather than kind of move away from me. Because we often think in heterosexual couples about male withdrawers and female pursuers, I like this cycle because it just outlines what a female withdrawer, male pursuer cycle could look like. And so here, just thinking about those kind of underlying feelings that you heard on the next slide, see if you can tune into those as you kind of read through this dialogue. So Frank says, listening to his wife on the phone, why'd you say that to your mom? You know I said I didn't want to go there. And she says, but we already agreed to this. And he says, he kind of amps up more, right? It doesn't matter what I say or what I want. You treat me like one of the kids. He's feeling kind of unheard, hurt, desperate, right? She moves away, right? She's kind of de-escalating. He follows her, right? That's all I get. And she's like, I don't know what else to do. I'm just trying to make everyone happy, right? I'm trying not to make things worse. But then he amps up more. That's the point. Everyone includes me. And then she kind of, shuts down more. Okay, so once you begin to understand attachment, then what do you do about it? How do you use this information to help your relationship? And so now the last part of this PowerPoint is all moving into strategies. And off and on, sometimes I teach workshops for couples, and these are a lot of the strategies that I teach. So the first one is I tell couples that it's okay to need other people. Everyone does. And even though that makes us feel vulnerable, that's kind of a commonality in our experiences. And so we have to kind of recognize that our romantic partners, have often become key attachment figures in our lives. The second piece is to understand your own cycle or your dance, to realize that the problem isn't in you or isn't in them, but it's often a pattern that's keeping you feeling disconnected. The next piece is to kind of tap into those layers of the onion, right? Underlying attachment feelings and needs, fears of being abandoned, inadequate, ashamed, alone. And so a way of understanding your cycle can be just mapping out a cycle like we did earlier in this PowerPoint. on paper, or it can be answering questions like this to kind of understand what the pattern of interaction is in your relationship. And then once we become more aware of our vulnerable feelings and our attachment needs, our fears that we're not good enough, or that our partner doesn't really want to be with us, we kind of have to take a risk and say those things, even if we wish we didn't have to, even if we just wish they could read our minds and know this. And then we have to ask for comfort or reassurance. And once our partner becomes more vulnerable with us and is telling us, no, I really do care about you. In fact, I care so much, that's why I pull away. We have to kind of accept this new version of our partner. And sometimes it takes us a while to see them in this new way. And then lastly, yeah, there's typically things from our family of origin that we're replicating in our romantic relationships. And a lot of times we have to address those in order to fully move forward in our romantic relationships.
So I've got a few slides here about strategies for individuals, less about a couple process. And the first one's just in general, right? The more we can try to figure out our attachment style, the more we'll kind of understand our behaviors in relationships. We also just have to remember that we all struggle in various ways, and so we're certainly not alone in our anxiousness or avoidance. We want to pay attention to those internal working models of ourself and other when we're starting to think or feel that we're unlovable or other people can't be trusted, kind of tuning into what triggered that and how we tend to respond. This idea of the more we can name our emotions to ourselves and eventually to others, we can kind of move through those and make changes. And you can see kind of paying attention to who you tend to gravitate towards. So for example, as someone who's a little bit more anxious, I've noticed that I'm really drawn to avoidant people because I tend to be overwhelming myself all the time. And so if I choose someone who's more avoidant, it's more likely that they won't further overwhelm me. And of course, we can process with our people around us, counselors, friends, family members, to better understand ourselves in relationships. Okay, so some specific strategies for someone who's a little bit more of an anxious attachment style. Basically, you're just trying to kind of notice that your brain is often kind of spinning maybe a little too intensely. You're ruminating a little bit too much about this relationship, maybe getting a little too fearful about it. And kind of having too many like highs and lows a little bit. So just kind of, stepping back, watching yourself do that, kind of trying to slow yourself down, not do as much rumination, which of course is super hard, but noticing it is the very first step. And, beginning to articulate to somebody that you're ruminating a lot about it. And for people who are avoidant, they're going to catch themselves kind of in all of their distancing strategies, right? The ways that they say this other person's not good, or by focusing on their imperfections or their neediness, the ways that they pull away when things get a little close, the ways that they tend to pine after people who are unavailable because those people are safer to pine after, or flirt with people that you're not committed to, things like that. And one interesting strategy for people who are more avoidant is because you may struggle more with kind of that face-to-face intimate connection, sometimes doing activities together where you don't always have to be communicating in a more direct way can help you relax and feel connected and have some moments of sharing, but some other moments where you're just hiking or biking or playing a game or things like that.
Lastly, here's some resources from the book Attached, which is the book I most often recommend to younger dating couples. There's a nice video here that gives an overview of the book, and you can also go online and take their compatibility quiz to determine your attachment style and that of your romantic partner.